So certainly there have been things that were lost, but what I'll say is that, especially when talking about the corpus of manuscripts in Byzantine notation from the sort of 10th century on, the problem isn't that we don't have it. The problem is that there are only few people on earth that actually know how to interpret the older manuscripts. Three of them happen to work for Cappella Romana. So the work that we do in Cappella Romana of bringing back to life some of these medieval manuscripts, we have barely scratched the surface of what there is. We've barely scratched the surface.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome my guest, John Michael Boyer, who is an expert in Byzantine chant, probably the foremost expert in Byzantine chant in the Anglophone world, and the associate director of Cappella Romana. And he is here to speak with us today about Byzantine chant. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. So tell me a little about yourself. Where are you currently, and how did you get there?
Well, currently I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, the Big Easy, the Crescent City, and been here just over 2 years with my wife and twin daughters. And we moved here from Portland, Oregon, which is, of course, the base of Cappella Romana, as you mentioned, and also where I grew up. But in the interim, after having grown up in Portland, I went to California for university, went to Boston for seminary, spent a lot of time in Greece, and eventually God sent us here to New Orleans. So what are you going to do? You never know where God's going to send you, and that's where we ended up.
Wow.
So, director of music and head chanter at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral here in New Orleans, which is actually the oldest Greek Orthodox community in North America, I believe in the Western Hemisphere generally. It was founded in 1864, and obviously not the same building as it was in 1864, but same continuously functioning community. So that part always is always fascinating to me, of just being part of a community that's been around so long here in the New World.
Wow. Did you say, so that's the oldest Greek Orthodox in the U.S.?
Yeah, at least in the U.S., if not in all of North America or indeed in all of the Western Hemisphere. There were communities that were founded before that were just didn't stick around. So a couple of communities, I believe in Florida and one in Texas, but that stopped functioning as a worshiping community after a few years. Holy Trinity New Orleans is the oldest continuously operating Greek Orthodox community in the Western Hemisphere from 1864.
So we have something a little bit in common there, in that the church that I work at is the oldest church in Charleston, or at least the oldest church building in Charleston. And there have been Anglicans worshiping here since 1680.
Oh, wow. Yeah, for sure.
And so the building is 1751, but the community goes all the way back to 1680. It was sort of originally St. Philip's and St. Michael's, and they kind of split into two because there were too many people, and
Sure.
but a little bit of history of the United States.
Absolutely.
So how long were you in Greece?
Well, I go to Greece periodically. That's where I met my wife. She's from Greece. My girls were born in Greece in the midst of the pandemic. So for instance, in 2020, I went to Greece 5 times, because of course my wife wasn't allowed to come here. And so I had to get special permission from the consulate to keep going to Greece to see my wife and eventually my wife and kids. I mean, the first time I went to Greece, I was 8 years old, and then I went when I was 18, and then I went when I was 25 or 21, and then 27, and I just kept going back after a while until it became sort of a regular habit. My mother's family was from Greece, so my mother was born in Portland, but her parents were from Greece. And in fact, as she likes to put it, she was born in Portland, but she was conceived in Greece because she was born 9 months almost to the day from my grandparents' wedding in Peloponnesos, in a very small town called Faraklava in Messenia. So I've always had Greece and the Greek language and Greek culture and food and music and so on as part of my own culture and my upbringing and my experience in life, but also very much in the sort of Anglo-American life as well. I mean, my father's family has been in the United States for many generations. According to one source of genealogy, apparently we're directly descended from William Henry Harrison, who was president for all of 6 weeks or whatever it was before he died of pneumonia that he caught at the inauguration. Another, apparently we have a direct ancestors, one of which that was one of the founders of Boston way back when. So I kind of live in two worlds, which honestly, given what I do in the context of the Greek Orthodox Church in America, actually has been a great help to me to have that kind of not even bifurcated, but just an experience that is informed by both the old world and the new world.
Sure, a bridge between two worlds.
Sure, yeah.
So have you always been involved in the Byzantine chant and church music in general?
Definitely always involved in church music in general. I would spontaneously break out into singing the Politikion, or dismissal hymn of Pentecost, when I was a very young child, because that I would hear it at every Divine Liturgy at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church, now Cathedral in Portland, when I was very young. And I used to say that I have been singing since I could talk, but then my mother corrected me and told me, no, you were actually singing before you could talk. And of course, growing up as a Greek Orthodox Christian, the opportunities to sing were, of course, at church. And so I would hang out with my parents who were in the choir at church, but then also my very first organized singing experience was the youth choir, the children's choir at Holy Trinity, when I was, I believe, 6 years old. And the choir was directed by a very young Alexander Lingus, who of course went on to found Cappella Romana and become my mentor for many years. And we are now family by a number of ways. My father was best man at his wedding, and then he baptized one of my daughters, Miriam. So it all kind of has been in the family. But as far as my experience of singing in church, it's always just been part of who I am. There was never a point where I just decided I'm going to do this. It was always sort of a fait accompli. It was always assumed that that's what I do. But when it comes to Byzantine chant specifically, there was a moment, and it was when Alexander Lingus was for a while the chanter at Holy Trinity in Portland, and my father had started going up to the chanter stand with him for a while, and I was about 14 when I just, on a whim, said, I think I'll start coming up to the chanter stand with you. Well, I didn't know what I was getting into, because that meant that then I had to be there, for matins, an hour plus before every Divine Liturgy on Sunday, and sit down with my dad and try to go over things and have sessions with Alexander. Even before we looked at a lick of notation, it was just sort of learning things by rote and apprenticing there at the chanter stand. And really, for a while, I did nothing but what we call hold ison or isokratima, which is the drone that is sustained at the base of the musical mode. And I did nothing but that basically for a year before I did anything else. So I like to say I came by it honestly. And to tell the truth, when thinking about how I came to Byzantine music specifically, I actually came to it rather late in life. If you look at how it's usually done in places like Greece and Lebanon and so on, when people start learning this stuff when they're 5 years old, right? Wow. So, but thank God, I've kept with it since then, and it's essentially become the foundation for my both my professional life and my creative life and my life in the church.
Sure. And to be a master chanter, because people might not know, I mean, people get degrees in this, right? They'll get a 4-year, and I believe with the old Georgian way, the master chanters of the Georgian system would do like 7 years of apprenticeship so they could learn all of the chants. And so it's not like, oh, I can kind of sing, so I'll join the choir. Now I'm a master chanter. I mean, how much work is it? How much development do you have to go through to get to the level of master chanter?
Well, if you go the traditional route in Greece, just to get your certificate, which essentially says you are a chanter, you know enough to chant services in church. It says nothing about teaching or composing or anything like that. It's a 5-year program, right? Now, it's not like an intensive, immersive program for 5 years, but it's also that, because what you do in the classroom may only be 2 or 3 times a week, but you're expected to be with your teacher in church at every single service during that time. And yeah, after 5 years, we kind of go through the program the way it's designed, which, by the way, and I mentioned this in one of the appendices of my book, the curriculum for how to train a chanter was actually standardized by the Greek government, and was published in the royal, because at that time Greece was under a monarchy, and in the royal newspaper, the royal magazine. Basically, these are the criteria for training a chanter now in our holy church, right? So that, and it goes back, I think that was from something like 150 years ago or so. So that's that. Those 5 years, that just means, okay, you're a chanter now. To get to the next level, which means you have the credential to teach, that they call that the diploma, and that's another, I want to say 2 or 3 years, where you get much deeper into the theory, into the fuller repertoire, and into ways of teaching and so on. So it's always funny to me when if now, I mean, I think this is changing in people's minds to some extent, but I've certainly gotten the attitude from people in the past of like, oh, you're a musician, it's all about talent, and God blessed you with this talent, which is true, right? We're all blessed with certain talents, but I worked for years to do what I do. And if you go talk to any chanter in Greece, worth his or her salt, they worked for years to learn how to do this, right? It is Byzantine music is a complete musical system unto itself, with a vast repertoire and certainly a vast living tradition, as I mentioned in the introduction of my book, boasting about 1,500 years. So it's a whole world unto itself, and so it takes that long to really learn how to do it.
Now, in Greece, do most churches have a chanter who's done the 5 years, who maybe if they can't teach, but they're still at that level? Because I will say I have been to Greek Orthodox churches where I'm pretty sure they did not have that, and whatever they had was some sort of I hate to just talk bad about the Greek Orthodox experience that I've seen, but they use the organ, but they don't know how to use the organ. So they're kind of playing this close approximation of something that's kind of like Byzantine chant, and then there's a bunch of choir members that are kind of singing it. But then I listened to the Divine Liturgy in Byzantine chant that y'all produced with Cappella Romana, and that is Byzantine chant. If that was my experience going to the Greek Orthodox, it's just a wildly different experience. So what is that? And how normative is that, and why?
Well, it's interesting. So you began your question asking about churches in Greece, but then you talked about your experience in going to Greek Orthodox churches here in the States. And the thing is, those are vastly different experiences, musically speaking. So the first part of your question, what goes on in Greece? These days now, most churches in Greece will have at least one qualified chanter. Okay. That's a change even from 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, which is around when I first went to Greece. So the Byzantine music as a discipline, as a study, and as an art form in Greece has just exploded over the last 50, 60 years. And before that, there were pockets around Greece of, in the major cities and so on, where you would have at least a few really good chanters, and they're legendary now. I mean, because talking about the 20th century, of course, they're the chanters of whom we actually have sound recordings. And so they're, and not only just in Greece, but also at the Patriarchate in Constantinople and Istanbul, starting in the early 20th century. Of course, we have recordings for these chanters now. But now it has become, the number of professional or semi-pro choirs, or just enthusiastic amateur choirs, strictly Byzantine choirs in Greece, I have no idea how many there are. I mean, there are just scores and scores of them. Wow. For a country that's pretty small, right? It's really something, just what has happened in the discipline in Greece in the last few decades. And what I will say about the Greek Orthodox experience here in America is that we are now on that track. We're just quite a few decades behind in the process. And to answer the other part of your question as to what is that we hear in Greek Orthodox churches in America, what you're hearing for the most part in a lot of these parishes is a format and a program of liturgical music that is essentially that is based on melodies that in the most general sense could be called Byzantine chant, but they're based on the compositions of one man, John Secularides, who was active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who, as a very, made a conscious effort to Westernize and simplify the melodic traditions of the Greek Orthodox Church at that time, because Greece only won its independence in the early to mid and in some parts of Greece late 19th century, right? Anything that was considered Eastern or had the flavor or sonority, the sound world of the East, was associated with the Turkish yoke. and was associated with Ottoman rule and what's generally referred to as the Turkokratia, the Turkish rule of the Greek nation. And so in the early 20th century, the melodies of John Sekelaritis became part of a sort of cultural and political movement to align Greece with Western Europe. And at that time, we'll talk about popular music. The most popular musical form in secular music was operetta in Greece, and so it was a very sort of self-conscious. We are now Westerners. We have thrown off the chains of our persecution under the Ottoman Empire and under Turkey, and we are aligning ourselves with Western Europe. Well, it's around that time that saw the biggest influx of immigration from Greece to the United States, and so they brought those melodies with them. And then when they're here, and those melodies lend themselves to harmonization, and in fact, there were publications that came out in Greece at the time that were some that were in Byzantine notation, some that were in Western notation, that harmonized the melodies of Chant and his students. And it was that music that came here to the States. And so then Greek American musicians and composers took those melodies and set them in their own way. Sometimes they would, in the case of a lot of the music of Frank Desby, or whose Greek name is Fotios Despotopoulos, would actually take the harmonizations that were already there under Sekelaritis and his students, and then just sort of play with them a bit and make them a little bit more refined and more developed. But in other cases, people like Taiki Zes and or Panayotis Zis and others, Peter Michailidis and so on. And the reason I know about all this is because we've recorded their works in Cappella Romana. Is that setting those melodies in their own way, in their own sort of harmonic language and idiom. So, sorry, the answer to this question is a lot longer than I think
great.
you probably
It's fascinating.
It
explains a lot of my experience.
Right. So, I mean, the short answer is because history. The long answer is what I'm giving you now. So, the long answer again is so we have that musical tradition that was developed here in the United States by immigrants and their children and grandchildren who were still of the mindset of, yes, we're Greek, we're proud of our Greekness, but what Greek means now is Western culture as well. And there are also elements of a sense of the need for conformity and adaptation to the to just say things plainly, white America in the 20th century, because, well, I'll just put it this way: there is a fraternal organization in the Greek community in America called AHEPA, an AHEPA, which stands for American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. That P in AHEPA, which stands now for progressive, used to stand for protective. Okay, why? Well, chapter 1 was Charlotte, chapter 2 was Atlanta. They were protecting the Greek community against the KKK. All right. And so what the part of this sense of survival in America was we remain true to our principles, to our roots, but we do so in a way that isn't going to rock the boat here in the United States, and that isn't going to make us so much other from white America, frankly, that is going to make it dangerous for us and our children. So all of that, believe it or not, is underneath the answer to this question, what is it that I'm hearing when I walk into a Greek Orthodox church today? So these days, when you walk into a Greek Orthodox church in America, in most parishes, and I apologize to my friends and colleagues who are at some of these parishes, but in most cases, what you're hearing is a vestige, sort of leftovers from that movement, that way of worshiping with that musical idiom. And in some cases, the choirs are made up of people who were members of the choir way back then in the 1950s and 60s, right? Still, and then what happens in 2020? The pandemic hits, and a lot of the choral programs and a lot of the parishes across the country died out, either literally or figuratively, just because it was impossible to try to put together a choir again after that, because for so long, who knew that singing in a choir was so dangerous, right? But there were all kinds of stories that came out during the pandemic that you sing in a choir, everything's going to become a super spreader event, and so choirs were essentially, if not banned, then at least disbanded temporarily until we came out of the pandemic. But then as churches have been coming out of the pandemic, they're trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? And in some cases, they're trying to rebuild that kind of choir with the organ and so on. And in some cases, they said, you know what? There's been so much work being done in Byzantine music in the last few decades. Let's go that route. And so you get kind of a mix of the two.
Wow. Well, despite being an organist, I am much more of a fan of the traditional Byzantine chant for a Greek Orthodox liturgy. But, I'm not Greek Orthodox, so to each their own. But it just doesn't seem like it fits. It's like, if you want the organ, then do some chorales and some English hymn tunes, you know what I mean? Like, go full Western Rite and do the music that was written for the organ.
Interesting. I mean, what I will say is that, and this is true, I think, for most churches of any kind, what you walk into a church and hear a choir do isn't necessarily like the Platonic ideal of what that's supposed to be.
Fair enough.
Right. And I will say that in Greek Orthodox churches in America, that seems to be especially true because of this history that I was talking about. But if you go and listen to Cappella Romana's recordings of these things, you realize, oh, that's what these people have in their minds. This is what they're remembering, at least on some level, from the good old days of these big choirs in the Greek Orthodox Church in America. I mean, I'd recommend listening to those just to get an idea of what it's actually supposed to sound like.
Right. Yeah. There's a bit of a chasm there between the ideal and but that's the way it is for everything,
Exactly.
If you listen to a Anglican choir singing some Stanford, it's not going to be the same as listening to the 16 or Westminster.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Same thing. There's levels to these things. So about the Byzantine chant in general, I have your book, the John Michael Boyer Byzantine Chant Lesson Book, The Received Tradition. And I would recommend it to anyone that wants to learn anything about Byzantine chant. Do you want to say anything about that before I give my experience and delve into some of the questions I have?
I'm sure we'll get into some interesting things with your questions, and so we'll see. I mean,
How long did it take to put this together? I think you told me it was like the culmination of 20 or 30 years worth of work.
Yeah, 20 plus years. Yeah, it started out as a translation, just a direct translation of a book by a friend and colleague, Yorgos Kostadinu in Athens. But as I was both doing the translation of the book and teaching at the same time, and using that translation of the book in teaching my students, I realized that a direct translation of a textbook in Greek for a musical idiom that is so, if not familiar to all Greeks, it's in the air, it's in the atmosphere, it's in the culture, there where it really isn't here, I realized I needed to explain a lot more than that book did. And so I started to expand the text. I would do the direct translation, and then I would add to it to try to explain a few things that were left unexplained because they were sort of implied, or oh, they'll hear that from their teacher, or oh, they'll understand that from the context of hearing this stuff in church. But none of which you can assume here in the States, and especially for people coming from, in some cases, either completely Western music background or sometimes no musical background, I realized I needed to explain a lot more.
Sure. I was trying to learn a Syriac chant, and from this guy, Gabriel Aydin, who produced the first Syriac hymnal in Western notation. And I went to meet him to try to figure out, well, I would love to learn how to sing one of these, to demonstrate. And it took maybe 3 hours to realize, like, the question wasn't translating. Is the E flat that's a quarter tone and has 3 on it, is that E that's flatted, or is that E flat that's flatted? And it just, the question didn't make any sense to him until finally I realized there was a table of something like an octoechoes, and then that showed which note was actually flatted.
Sure.
And then I'm like, okay, you got to write something in here, because, if you just did that all the time, you would just take it for granted. You'd have no idea that, So I wrote a little paragraph for him to explain to, Americans, no, it's the E flat that's flatted, or whichever it was at the time.
Yeah.
So
probably the E natural that was flatted, but anyway.
It was probably the E natural that was flatted. I don't remember now. It was like 5 years ago. But anyway, it was fascinating. So my experience trying to read through this, I very quickly came to the realization that after about the first chapter, you would just kind of need to live with that for a while.
Yeah.
Before going on. Like, it's not a thing you can read the first chapter and then just keep going and come back to the first chapter. You kind of got to get the scale in your ears and get whatever notation that's built, and then really build upon that to keep going. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, that's why I specify even in the title that it's a lesson book, right? And so it's a progressive method, right? The very first thing you learn before even looking at a lick of notation is, this is the scale, this is what it sounds like. Now, that sounds crazy because this is a book and books don't make sound. But of course, there are recordings online that are associated with the book. And so, yeah, that's step one. Just get that scale in your ears and be able to reproduce it and get to know the solfege syllables, and so on. And then you move on to, okay, this is how the notation tells us to move within that scale. And the next lesson that actually teaches that, which is lesson 3, you just learn how to move by step, right? Because the notation is what we call diastematic, comes from the Greek word diastema, which means interval. And so it shows you what interval to sing rather than what note to sing. And so you just learn to move by step. And then you move on to rhythmic augmentation, and then moving by thirds and fourths, and then rhythmic subdivision, and so on. And you have to keep building on it to finally get to the point where you're presented with anything in Byzantine notation, and at the very least you can execute the contour of the melody, even if you're not getting all the intervals right in whatever scale it happens to be in, because that comes along in chapter 3 when we talk about modal theory. So no, it's very consciously written that way of each lesson building on the previous one.
Sure. Now the notation that you have, it is wild to me to see, like this type of notation.
Yeah.
How old is that system of notation?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean. This specific iteration of the notation, it depending on who you ask and what uh, factors you want to take into account, it's either from the early 19th century or from the mid to late 20th century, depending on what factors you want to take into account in classifying this particular iteration of the notation. But generally speaking, it is the same notation that's been in use since the early 19th century. So 1815 was the I believe the theory book that was published in what we call the New Method, and 1820 was the first book, music book that was printed in this new method. But as it, generally speaking, as a notational form, I won't say system because they kind of re-systematized it in the 19th century. Well, it has roots in notation that goes back to the 10th century. Okay,
Oh,
ninth,
okay.
10th century, which is around the same time that we see the first music notation in the West as well, right?
Right.
So there's some parallelisms there for sure. Um, the first diastematic notation that shows intervals like that, I believe, was around the 10th century. There was some other notation that previous to that were essentially just expanded forms of diacritical marks on the text, telling you
Okay.
how you're meant to um, uh, chant slash recite the scriptures. And but clearly the musical tradition, the melodic tradition, existed before the notation did, right?
Right.
That's usually how these things work. They come up with ways with writing down what they're already doing, and then as that goes on through the centuries, they come up with more and more refined ways to show certain details, until you get to the 19th century where they realized, all right, we're going to come up with a system that shows precise rhythmic subdivisions, and so that you don't have to learn absolutely everything from your teacher as to how to sing this particular phrase or formula. It will actually be explicit in the notation. But because before that, that's what it was. The notation would give you a bunch of these signs that would tell you the shape of the melody and what a particular melodic formula was, but exactly how you would sing that formula is something you learned from your teacher. It wasn't necessarily explicit in every detail on the page.
And this is like pre 900s,
Pre 1900s, yeah,
pre
pre
1900s.
18 pre 19th century, pre 18 1810 15, yeah. Um,
Okay, so that new notation style,
mhm.
right? Like in the 1500s, for example, if you looked at it, you wouldn't necessarily just be able to auto generate the hymn if you hadn't heard it before.
Right. Well,
Okay.
yes and no. I mean, it depends on what your background was, right? If you were a master chanter in the 15th century and you knew all the formulas and the way you would do it, then yeah, you could do it. But for somebody learning or and learning the nuances of the chant and so on, there are certain things that just weren't on the page, especially when it came to rhythm. Okay.
Oh, okay.
But that was systematized and refined and made more explicit in the 19th century. And that's essentially the notation that's in my textbook, and my subsequent two music books came out after that.
It seems a little more, even though, like you said, you'd have to have some knowledge of the Byzantine. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it's a little more accurate than, for example, like Gregorian Neum notation from way early, where you really had no idea what the intervals were. Where it's like it had like the contour of it, and so if you knew, like if you really knew the tradition, you could figure it out, but you had no idea what the intervals were in the
Yeah,
slightest.
that's interesting. That's interesting. There's an iteration of the notation that's similar to that in the Byzantine tradition, but it came up with the diastematic, again showing intervals, precise intervals system relative. I mean, like I said, 10th century, I believe, I have to double check that, but yeah, 10th century. And by the 12th century, then we're really kind of rolling in this diastematic notation and then there's another reform of the notation in the 14th century that kind of expanded the possibilities there as well, and expansion of the musical theory itself, and allowed for more interesting and sort of off the wall modulations and change of mode within a given piece.
Mm-hmm.
And so and this is kind of what I think the main thing to take away from this in talking about all these minutiae is that this is what happens when you're dealing with an unbroken living tradition spanning about 1,500 years, right? It just continues to be worked on and developed and refined and added to and so on over the course of many centuries by the people who are doing it. I mean, I think the biggest difference, musically speaking, with respect to its history between what we usually refer to as Byzantine chant and, let's say, the various forms of Western chant, is that there was at no point did somebody come in and say, you know what, scrap what we're doing, we're starting from scratch. That happened a number of times in the West, right? And so what you get now with what we most often refer to as both the received tradition and the classical repertoire, including music melodies from, let's say, as far back as, let's say, the 17th century all the way through the 19th century, is essentially the result of this refinement and development over the course of many, many centuries. And so in some cases it's extremely refined. I mean, just the certain melodies that you were to, if you were to move one note out of place, it would not come across the same way. I mean, really some beautiful works. And also, I mean, you can see the shelf behind me. These are all Byzantine chant books, and they're all different, right? And that's not even all of them, right? That's just the ones that I happen to have in the office right now. And so it's a vast repertoire that has everything from the simplest chants that you would do on in the simplest service, all the way up to pieces that are only really exist as essentially masterworks or etudes that are there to demonstrate the beauty and expression and compositional voice of a particular composer. I mean, it's a vast melodic tradition.
Yeah, for sure. Now let me ask, so for example, the Syriac tradition has been at various points in history, and especially in the last decade, vast amounts of their corpus of hymnody was at risk of being lost due to the Syrian civil war and due to people not really learning Aramaic and ancient Syriac, and it was at risk. And I know, listening to the I read John Graham's dissertation on Georgian chant, and a bunch of Georgian chant has been totally lost to the vicissitudes of war and history. And some of it was barely saved. Like, it's almost miraculous what we still have left. And I think it's the same with Armenian tradition. I'm really hoping to eventually talk to someone in the Armenian tradition that's an expert in their chant, because I want to know more about Komitas and how much he actually preserved all of their stuff. But in the Byzantine tradition, has that been a thing? Was there a time where all this chant was almost lost, or is there stuff that we know is lost that'll never be recovered, or that needs preservation work? Or is it more like the Coptics, sorry for the long question, but the Coptics, for example, they've had immense persecution, but it seems like they've had less of that, almost losing their entire corpus of chant. It seems like it's stayed pretty strong, at least from those who I've talked to. So what about Byzantine chant?
So certainly there have been things that were lost, But what I'll say is that, especially when talking about the corpus of uh, manuscripts in Byzantine notation, uh, from the sort of 10th century on, the problem isn't that we don't have it. The problem is that there are only few people on earth that actually know how to interpret the older manuscripts. Um, uh, Three of them happen to work for Cappella Romana. So so the work that we do in Cappella Romana of bringing back to life some of these medieval manuscripts, we have barely scratched the surface of what
Wow.
there is. We've barely scratched the surface. When it comes to what we call the received tradition is a combination of um, pieces from that medieval period that were transcribed into the new method of notation with a particular methodology that can be rather controversial, combined with new compositions from the 19th century, from the teachers and composers and scribes and exegetes, the interpreters of that older music in the 19th century. And even just that, as I said, is a huge corpus of music. But there is many times more than that of the huge corpus that we have in the received tradition that are sitting in manuscripts just waiting to be brought back to life. So our problem isn't that we've lost all of this stuff. It's that we have so much work yet to do to bring so much of this repertoire to life from these older manuscripts. Thank God, the sources of manuscripts, and then beginning with the 19th century printed books and so on, for Byzantine music weren't centrally localized in any one place. So you have a number of centers of Byzantine music across the that part of the world. So as Alexander Lingus likes to call, from Beirut to Bucharest. The Patriarchate in Turkey, in Istanbul. All right, so that there are some archives there. Mount Athos in Greece, a huge treasure trove of Byzantine manuscripts. The Monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, another one. And then various places that have gotten a hold of manuscripts and to quote unquote save them, that ended up in American universities and British universities and European universities. And so again, there's just, our problem isn't that, oh no, we've lost so much of this material. It's that we just have so much more work to do to bring it back to life, some of these older melodies.
Well, I'm glad that Cappella Romana is doing the work. And so you said 3 of the people who can read these manuscripts all work for Cappella Romana. Is that one of the main goals and purposes of Cappella Romana, to sort of reinvigorate and refine? Like, I listened to the Hagia Sophia album, which is super fascinating. And I know there's a lot of, reconstruction of the audio so that it would sound like it was supposed to sound, like in Hagia Sophia before it was changed. And but
yeah, well, and that's exactly the repertoire that I'm talking about. It's these manuscripts of melodies that were written between the 10th and 16th centuries, that are written in this older form of the notation, that, especially when it comes to interpreting it for performance, right? So one of the things that has happened in Byzantine musicology, going back now a long time, is that scholars in the West discovered these manuscripts and started to transcribe them and interpret them, with the a priori assumption that, of course, this medieval chant sounded exactly like how we think Gregorian chant should sound, meaning influenced by the monastery of Salem. Even that assumption about Gregorian chant is a big problem, okay? Because essentially the very sort of ethereal, rhythmically free, and frankly, expressively uninteresting interpretation of Gregorian melodies, that's all just because of what the monastery of Salem did. Now, the monastery of Salem did incredible work in essentially resurrecting and saving that repertoire for the Western Church, and God bless them. And when I was a little kid, I went to the monastery of Salem and I heard them chant services, and it was wonderful, right? But there are also literally scores of, in other words, it's like 48 theoretical treatises on how you're supposed to interpret Gregorian chant, and they talk about ornamentation and pitch slides and all kinds of things that you find in how a traditional chanter interprets Byzantine chant. And so some of the work that we do in Cappella Romana is not only sort of bringing back to life medieval Byzantine melodies, but also bringing back to life Western medieval melodies using the same approach, because of these various treatises on how those melodies were meant to be performed as well. And so, I mean, it's a Byzantine musicology is a really, really interesting field because of this. So what happened was these Western scholars went in there and said, okay, we're just going to notate these things basically as blobs on the page, no rhythm, no interpretation, no expression, nothing. And that method of interpreting those manuscripts has continued on some level in the academic community and musicology since then. There was a huge backlash from the cantorial community in Greece saying, what are you talking about? Nobody would ever sing these melodies like that. And so then there was a whole movement, frankly, rather sort of nationalist movement of insisting no, Byzantine music has always been what it is today and has never changed. The only thing that has changed is how we write it down. And of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so a lot of what we do in Cappella Romana is not only bring back to life these medieval Byzantine melodies, but also demonstrate how East meets West, both in East Byzantine melodies and in Western chant melodies, Gregorian chant, Old Roman chant, etc. And so that's also a lot of what you hear in our recordings. The Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia record, which I mean is, I would say, one of the most important records of the last decade, just as far as generally as classical music goes, but certainly of ecclesiastical music. One of the things that makes that so special is that not only did we just sort of recreate what Hagia Sophia might have sounded like, technicians actually went into Hagia Sophia and measured the acoustics of the room, and then turned that into a digital acoustic model, and that's what we sang it in. And so we sang melodies that were written for that room and sang it, quote unquote, in that room, but digitally speaking, because of course, they don't allow people to sing in there anymore unless it's for the Islamic services now that it's been turned back into a mosque.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's interesting hearing about how Western music probably isn't this very ethereal, sometimes saccharine version of the chant, but it could have more rhythmic complexity and ornamental complexity, and of course the temperamental complexity. I was reading in the book about the differences between the Western scale and the typical major scale, and I know there's not just like one major scale, and maybe even saying the term scale is a little anachronistic, but could you briefly talk and maybe even demonstrate the difference between, for example, like the Western major scale and then what the Byzantine major scale would sound like?
Sure. I mean, but even before doing that, though, we have to understand and remember that even in Western music, there are different interpretations of what a major scale is, right?
Mm-hmm.
These days, we tend to think that a major scale is what you get when you start on C and play all the white keys on the piano. But that's according to equal temperament, which is a system that was developed tuning-wise to facilitate modulating into every key possible, and them all essentially sounding around the same. That wasn't the case even in Bach's well-tempered clavier, because well-tempered does not mean equal-tempered, right? So there was a tempering of the tuning in order to facilitate modulations into the various keys, but the keys sounded different, right? And so when you get into a really far off key like E major or something, that G sharp would just be incredibly harsh. It would have this really jarring sound to it.
Yeah,
Which
people
of course
miss this. Just sorry to interrupt, but people totally miss this. And when you hear like sometimes like an E7, I mean, there's like a pain to it.
absolutely.
So like he totally incorporates this in a lot of his music to show the pain of the crucifixion. Or E flat has like there's a reason that Klavierübung 3 is like begins and ends in E flat. Like it has a particular characteristic to other keys, and then C major is this sort of heavenly thing because it's like the most in tune. And so yeah, for sure, Bach was sort of in between. I think he definitely played around, even though he preferred more of an equal-tempered style because he wanted to compose on all the keys and modulate wherever he wanted to go. He still did play around with the intrinsic qualities of the different keys. And I think some people lose that.
Yeah. Absolutely he did. And everybody did around that time. And so, I mean, it was understood like that different keys had fundamentally different sonorities to them. So if we take that and then we go over to the Byzantine system, it's not actually all that weird that we have two different scales that are basically like a major scale, but not quite. And then we have a couple other scales that are very much not, right? So if what we're dealing with is just an equal tempered major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? That scale does exist in Byzantine music, but most often what you hear for something like that would be ni, pa, vu, ga, di, ke, so, ni, so, ke, di, ga, vu, pa, ni. So that the third and the seventh of the scale are just ever so slightly low. Mm-hmm. To quote an old choir director of mine, just enough to drive you nuts. But what's interesting about that is that it, whereas the third degree of the scale in an equal tempered or and other Western tunings of the major scale, that third of the scale, do, re, mi, fa, really wants to resolve to that fourth, right? The E really wants to resolve to the F if we're in C. And certainly ti, do, really wants to resolve to that C, right? Well, ni, pa, vu can just kind of hang out there a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. It has its own identity. It has its own personality. It's not just, oh, I'm a leading tone to the next note up. And in fact, there are modes that are based on that note. Ni, pa, vu, legetos, ek neotitos mu, po, la, po, la, mi, me, pa, si. Okay, so that actually functions as a base of one of the modes in that scale. Okay, so that's what in the school that I come from we call the soft diatonic scale. A lot of other schools of Byzantine music simply call it the diatonic scale. And then we have chromatic scales that are referred to as both soft and hard chromatic. So that is the legatos kind of has that feel to it as well, but then above the G or the sol or the V, that's soft chromatic. And then hard chromatic is actually much easier for the Western ear to hear because, well, you just have to think of any kind of Arabic pop or the some of the songs from Aladdin, right? Mm-hmm. And that is really, really, really close to if you just went to a piano or a keyboard and played D, E flat, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C sharp, D, right?
Okay.
With disjunct chromatic tetrachords.
And you said is that hard chromatic?
Hard chromatic, right.
And what would soft chromatic be?
Soft chromatic was the one I just did before that.
Oh, okay.
Really ambiguous, really sort of nebulous sound, to the point where even to a trained cantor's ear, sometimes you'll if you come into the middle of a piece in that system, it takes a while to orient yourself as to which is the third and which is the bass and which is the third below and so on, because all the trichords are so similar. In fact, in some ways of teaching that tuning, they're equal, and which makes it really ambiguous. So it's a whole other world. It's a whole other sonority. And as I like to say to people who come to Cappella Romana concerts, especially if it's a heavily chant-based program, what I like to tell them is you have to listen differently. You have to listen kind of to in between the notes. And as I say to my students, to really get into the tuning of these, it's like you have to do a pinch zoom on every note, right? And just be in the note, every single note. And then also step back and see the entire shape of a melody and where it's going and the structure of it. And then in addition to that, there's all the ornamental things and expressive devices that we use to extend legato and show text accents and all kinds of things. It's a fully developed, coherent, cohesive art form all its own. And I think that's actually one of the things that is most difficult. And I don't get me wrong, I love teaching professional musicians when they when they want to learn Byzantine music. I'm like, all right, this is going to be fun. But one of the things that they have to sort of shake off of themselves is the sense of, oh, okay, so this Byzantine scale, it's basically like C major, but with a couple of differences. Or this one, this is basically like F major, but with a couple of, this is basically like if I played, a G, A flat, B, C on the piano, but I just have to mess with it. And I have to tell them, okay, you can think about that you can think about it in those terms for about the next month. But after that, you've got to just throw away all of that and just meet it on its own terms.
It's like Orthodox theology.
It is, actually.
You can't think of it, Yeah. I'm not Orthodox, but I'm interested, I think it's very fascinating. And I went through a whole thing where I said, I'm not going to read any Western theology for the next 5 years. I'm only going to listen to Orthodox priests and theologians and read early church fathers. And now I feel like I kind of understand the lingo, It's like when a monk, like I asked a monk, could anyone be sure of their salvation? Has there anyone been sure of their salvation? And he, his response was, well, maybe one monk in the desert, could have been sure, but he would never tell anyone. And of course, that's not what a Western person means when they're like sure of their salvation. They're like, can you a Western person means, can you trust in the mercy of God? But
Right,
the monk
right.
was meaning, did he achieve perfect theosis in this lifetime? Which is just a totally not the same use of language. So
Right, right.
anyway, different parallel, but I kind of feel like it's the same thing. You
No,
can't
it
take
really
Western
is.
concepts and put it in the Eastern music.
And frankly, I think that is um, that problem of context, background, and significance in the home language, I think is responsible for so many of the misunderstandings and
Mm-hmm.
fights and wars that occur over things like religion and philosophy and systems of government, all that kind of thing. If you're not, if this is why, there's a rule in translation that you never translate into a language in which you're not completely fluent, right? And it's because if you if you try to translate into a language in which you're not completely fluent, you're gonna get um, at the very least certain nuances wrong, and sometimes that can be the whole ball game, right? And honestly, it's the same in music. You have to. So uh, my dear friend, and he was best man in my wedding, Dr. Alex Khalil, is a musicologist, ethnomusicologist. He's now at College University at Cork, Ireland, and he came from the school of ethnomusicology that is was sort of polar opposite from what most people were doing at the time. And I forget who his mentor was, it was a system wherein, okay, you want to go study a particular musical culture, you go there and you live with them, and you see what it's like from the inside out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because anytime you make uh, any observation you make about something is necessarily going to carry with it bias and assumption, right? And so you have to go there and actually live it for a while and do it with them in order to get any sense of how it actually works, what it actually is. And I think that there's something to that uh, when dealing with something like Byzantine music as a Westerner. It's what I
Sure.
had to do. I went to Greece and studied with Lykurgos Angelopoulos. Then I went back to Greece and I studied with Ioannis Arvanitis, and then immersed myself in the melodic tradition. And I'm coming at it not as a complete foreigner, right? I grew up with some form of this music as I was growing up, but it takes that kind of immersion to really throw away all of those preconceived notions about what music is to begin with, to let alone about certain, details and nuances and elements of tuning or whatever, to say nothing of vocal technique,
Mm-hmm.
and actually meet the musical tradition on its own terms. And that's what I try to do with my textbook, and that's what I try to do in my composition as well of Byzantine music in English, of um, setting the English language in the same way that the traditional composers of Byzantine music set the Greek language, right? Rather than trying to take a piece in Greek, white out the Greek, and write in the English and just hope that the syllables fall in some sort of coherent manner, which is, frankly, for a long time, that's what people did. And it's not until the last 25 years that we started looking at things in a different way.
Interesting. Now, speaking of that, adapting the Byzantine chant for English, what are some of the similarities and differences, and how cogent is Byzantine chant via, in Lebanon versus Egypt versus Greece versus, somewhere else? And what are some of the stylistic differences or things you might point to?
Well, the first point I would make is that there's a wide spectrum of local traditions and interpretations of Byzantine music, even just within Greece and Turkey, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
even just within sort of where the origins and centers of Byzantine music are. And then that increases quite a bit when you go into other cultures that have adapted the music to other languages. Now, when you're talking about Byzantine music in Arabic, that's actually relatively new. I mean, up until I want to say mid 20th century, all of the liturgical services in the churches in Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, etc., were in Greek.
Okay.
And then they started to incorporate Arabic, and then started to set Byzantine music in Arabic. And of course, at first it was by ear, and then eventually started writing down specific settings of the Arabic language in Byzantine music, and there are different approaches to how they did that. And the same thing is true in Romania and Bulgaria, and I mean, and I like saying this because it really ticks off some of my Greek friends and colleagues. Byzantine music in Arabic and Byzantine music in Romanian are vastly superior to Byzantine music in Greek, and it just has to do with what the vowel sounds are. But they're really something. They're really something. We had the experience of performing at the Byzantine Music Festival in Iași, Romania, to which we're returning this May, actually. And we were sort of, the Cappella Romana singing the Lost Voices of Hagia Sophia was essentially the headline. The opening act for that concert was the monastery choir from Hamatura in Lebanon. And they got on stage, and within 1 minute of them singing, we're waiting backstage. We turned to each other like, how are we going to follow this? This is the most incredible thing we've ever heard. It was really something. I love hearing Byzantine music in other languages. But I will say that, when it comes to setting Byzantine music in other languages, as I think there is always the case with things like this, some attempts are more successful than others. And that's certainly true in English. We're still in the process. I mean, although I think we've essentially achieved a methodology, discovered a methodology that works in general very well, it's still being developed. And there's still certain nuances of the English language that, as I'm composing, I'm like, yeah, I mean, if I were just to take this formula from Greek, it fits the syllabic content of the phrase I'm looking at, but it really doesn't reflect the little nuances of what secondary accents there might be and that kind of thing. That we're still working those things out now in English, and frankly, they're still working them out in other languages too. So it's actually really exciting. Greek and English are not completely dissimilar, but they're not completely similar either, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, the prevalence in English of the accented monosyllabic word, right? Okay. Think of words like peace, love, God, Christ, right? These are all words that in Greek have multiple syllables, right? Mm-hmm. And so even just the existence of so many accented monosyllabic words in the language in which I'm writing a musical form that was developed and designed for a language that really doesn't have that presents its challenges. And that's just one thing, right? I mean, mm-hmm. The issue that most people talk about is just the difference in syllabic quantity, right? How many syllables there are in Greek versus how many there are in English. And then the ratio is usually around 2-1 or 1.8 to 1, and so that presents challenges as well. But I think my friends and colleagues and I have developed a way of doing things that in general works quite well. And then, we just have to make the sign of the cross, hope that God blesses our endeavors, publish what we publish, and it'll be in 100 and 150 and 200 years that it remains to be seen as to whether or not what we've done actually stands the test of time.
Sure. Now, for example, in places that now have Arabic chant, like in Lebanon, before they did Byzantine chant in Arabic, were there differences even when they were singing Byzantine chant in Greek? Were there differences between that and how it would be sung on Athos? And like, what might those differences be?
Sure.
Like ornamentation or anything like that?
Well, I think, no matter where you are, you will absorb whatever whatever your local culture is. And that will present itself in some way in how you do any kind of music. That's true when you hear Americans singing opera in Italian versus you listen to Italians singing opera in Italian. Now, to the untrained ear, they may sound exactly the same, but if you ask an Italian speaker, I was like, oh yeah, that guy's American, right? But there's not necessarily bad, right? Because when you get to a certain level, just the artistry and the skill that it takes to do something like that means that they're operating a very high level. But you can still hear little nuances, right? And that's okay. That's part of how music happens in real time, created by humans in real time. Part of the problem with answering a question like this is that we now live in an era and in a society in which most music is consumed through sound recordings. And for most of the history of the world, that just wasn't true, right? In order for there to be music, there had to be a musician present. And so the sense of every performance, even by the same musician of the same piece, would be different, right? So it goes without saying, really, that the way I would sing, let's say, Lord, I Have Cried in the first mode in Byzantine music, in the Byzantine tradition, in Greek, is going to sound different from the last time I did it, but also vastly different from one of my friends and colleagues, even if they come from exactly the same school and are trained by exactly the same people. And then that just continues until you get to, we're talking about somebody halfway around the world who, rather than having grown up in an English-speaking culture, has grown up in an Arabic-speaking culture. And yet you listen to them and you can absolutely recognize what the piece is, and it feels at home, but there are always going to be slight differences in style, in tuning, in nuance, in ornamentation, and expression. Always. But that's true across the board. I think we can get sort of bogged down by the sense of national identity and cultural differences, and not realize that, like, the difference between my singing the same piece from the difference between my singing the same piece as that piece being sung by my teacher or that piece being sung by my student, you hear differences, right? And so those kinds of differences are actually what makes music in general actually interesting. Because if you get the sense that, and again, especially in our era of sound recordings, oh, I have that piece. What that means is you have one recording of that piece, and in your mind, that's all that piece will ever be. Whereas that was never the case before sound recordings. It was always, oh, have you heard how they do it? Have you heard how they do it? Have you heard how he does it? Have you heard how she does it? Right. And that's just part of the musical world, and part of the beauty of it, actually. I love hearing Byzantine music done by people from completely different backgrounds, as long as they're good, and hearing some of those nuances. Right? I love hearing I just had the opportunity of chanting with a choir from Romania because I was giving a workshop in Texas, and they just happened to be in town. So we sang an all-night vigil together, and hearing them sing stuff in Romanian is just so fantastic. But then they would do stuff in Greek as well, and I just had this big smile on my face listening to how they interpreted the traditional Greek repertoire. I mean, it's fascinating, and as my late spiritual father, Father Ephraim Lash, would say, it's great fun, right? I mean, that's kind of why we do it anyway.
But if you don't mind my asking, like, would most of the corpus be the same, or would it be different in the way that, like, Gregorian, I guess pre-Gregorian, there was all kinds of different chants, but then even when Gregorian came, there was still like Melodies chant and Mozarabic chant, and then like those are Western chants that that maybe someone today would, say is Gregorian, but Mozarabic chant is definitely not Gregorian chant,
right?
And so would it be the same like in different regions that are loosely Byzantine? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
how wide is the difference? Like,
it really depends on what you're asking about, because there are settings of Byzantine music in other languages from other parts of the world that are very clearly recognizable. That's Byzantine chant. There are always going to be differences because they're writing in a different language.
Mm-hmm.
That's necessarily going to mean that the melody has changed because it needs to fit the words that they're using, unless they're using a meter translation or they're really trying to shoehorn the new language into the old melody, which there's still instances of that. But it's still recognizable as Byzantine music, and no one would bat an eye and say, well, that's not Byzantine music. However, in almost every one of these cultures that has absorbed Byzantine music, there was also an offshoot of that is often referred to as whatever that culture is, chant. Romanian chant, Bulgarian chant, Serbian chant. And I don't know of anything specifically referred to as like Arabic chant, because I would say in general they're more sort of faithful to the central tradition of Byzantine music. Just in terms of what has been produced and what is done liturgically. But in these other places, you have both of these musical traditions there at the same time, and depending on where you go in that country, you're going to hear more sort of central repertoire Byzantine music, or you're going to hear more Romanian chant or Serbian chant, which on some level is drawn from that Byzantine tradition, but done in a way that has sort of absorbed more of the local flavor, and often is more sort of a popular and populist, I think, in the way it's approached musically. It's often simpler, more, and I don't mean any derogatory meaning in this at all, but more sort of sing-songy, right? The melodies are catchier, and so you get all kinds of things. I mean, that really is the answer to the question: is you get all kinds of things, and unfortunately, I have a lot of friends and colleagues, some of whom, and all of whom really, that I respect deeply, and some of whom will insist that, all of that, all of those local chant traditions aren't worth anything. They should just embrace the central repertoire of Byzantine music and be done with it. And I would say that would be a great loss. There are islands in Greece that have their own musical tradition, liturgical tradition, and in some cases have their own system of the 8 modes that really have almost nothing to do with Byzantine music, and yet they also have Byzantine music.
And yeah, there's like an Alaskan 8 modes, which is like a variant on the Slavic, but it's only done in this one part of Alaska,
Yeah. So, I think in general, and this is why I'm sort of of two minds about things, because when people come to me and say that they want to learn Byzantine music, my response is, okay, but you're actually going to learn Byzantine music with me. I don't do that other stuff, because you get that other stuff here in the States too, where you're essentially getting people who are singing sort of quasi and Westernized versions of Byzantine melodies, and stylistically they sound nothing like Byzantine music. And it's not that that's evil that it exists. It's just not what I do, and it's not what I teach. All right. And so, but I've heard people sing that stuff beautifully, just as I have heard people attempt to sing traditional Byzantine music very not beautifully. And so again, you just, it's kind of, everything exists everywhere, and you just, and one of the traps that we fall into, especially when it comes to liturgical music, is comparing the best case scenario of our own practice with the worst case scenario of somebody else's practice. And because you basically just taken the legs out of anybody who would make a case for any other musical expression. And so we have to be careful with that.
Yeah, I saw a YouTube video of it was like Orthodox versus Catholic, and it was the most hierarchical in some cathedral in Russia where everything's Chesnikov and incense and icons, and then it was like the worst Catholic mass where they're doing like a circus inside the church or something.
Right.
And I'm like, come on, this is not like
exactly.
You could do the opposite video, sort of.
I mean, you wouldn't find any circuses in an Orthodox church, but sometimes it feels like it is. Don't get me wrong. There's, yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like to me, as far as like the variants of the tradition, it sounds like there's places like Bulgaria and Romania where they have at the same time the traditional Byzantine chant that they do, as well as like a local flavor that you might be able to dub Romanian and Bulgarian. And then there are some places which, there's slight on the continuum. It's pretty much just Byzantine chant, but it's, little variations due to the idiosyncrasies of the language and things like that. And then there's, maybe on the opposite side of the continuum, there are places like Georgia, which may or may not, but probably do have an antecedent in Byzantine chant at some point way in the past. But now it's really, for, centuries, it's been its own tradition, and it's not really related to Byzantine chant at all.
When it comes to Georgia, you're sort of opening a can of worms there. So I'm not even going to touch that. Because
I know at least Georgia, it's like they would have a Russian patriarch and then a Byzantine patriarch, and then Russian and then Byzantine, and then and they're kind of untouched by everyone, and even their language group is its own language group.
Yeah, no, of course, and I've been in touch with people who have been setting Georgian in traditional Byzantine chant as well. And I was like, oh, that's great. But, God help you if you lose your local liturgical music. Yeah. I mean, every time I hear a Georgian choir, I'm like, I wasted my life. This is what I should have done, right? So it's pretty remarkable. Yeah, it really is. It really is. And and I think that's, and when it comes, so bringing things home now, I think with the Greek Orthodox Church in America, and here's where I probably part from a lot of my friends and colleagues here, because although go and ask anybody in Byzantine in the Greek Orthodox Church in America who knows anything about me, and they will probably say, "Oh, I'm a Byzantine chant hardliner, and I can't stand anything else in the church." It's just not true. Literally sung on recordings of Cappella Romana, recording Taikis S and Frank Desby and Peter Michailidis and Steve Kardiazamenos and all kinds of, and I myself have composed things, not Byzantine chant per se, and been involved with projects that incorporate all kinds of musical expression that are come out of the Greek American tradition. But, and I will say what I said to a student the other day at the Liturgical Arts Academy in there in South Carolina. To me, and really I'm just paraphrasing something my dad said once. For me, Byzantine music is enough liturgically. but that doesn't mean that there isn't room for anything else. Right. So Byzantine music is a fully formed tradition unto itself, fully formed musical system unto itself. It's its own world. It's a vast universe of sounds. But if you apply, let's say, polyphony as what its original use, intention and use was way back when, which was a sort of ornament on the normal chant system, the normal just chant is what you did, and then if you did a piece of polyphony, it was like an ornament. It was something calophonic. It was a beautification of a particular moment in the service. Then I think there's room for that if you can do it well. The problem now is that we are in a we're in a world now where lots and lots of Greek Orthodox churches in America are trying to hold on to a way of doing things that just doesn't work anymore because they don't have the people to sing the polyphony anymore. And so we have to go back to the tradition of Byzantine chant is just what you do. This is all the services of the Orthodox Church, by the way, assume that you're doing Byzantine music. Every modal attribution in not in chant books, in liturgical books. Liturgical books are on this side. In these books, they give you what mode. That's assuming you're doing Byzantine music, right? And so if that is just your base and just what you do, then if you do some polyphony here and there as a way of beautifying a particular liturgical moment in a different way, because there's plenty in Byzantine music that beautifies a liturgical moment, then there's room for that. But we've got to be able to do our chant tradition well first, and then add to that, and have to be able to do the polyphony well. And really it comes down to that. Whatever you do in a liturgical context for the benefit of the community, you have to do as well as possible. And I prefer Byzantine music being the standard for the Greek Orthodox expression of the liturgical life, but that's not the only thing there is. And I'd much rather hear an OCA parish do everything in obichod chant, which I really can't stand, and do it well, than listen to a cantor who thinks he's doing traditional Byzantine music but has no idea what he's doing, and it makes me, and it grates in my ears, right? Whatever we do, we have to do it as well as we can.
Sure, fair enough. For the record, I'm also not a big fan of obichod chant. I think the other, I'd rather hear just, monophonic Xenomony or...
Sure, I mean, Xenomony is a fantastic melodic tradition. Has some roots in Byzantine music, but a very early form of Byzantine music as well. But don't get me wrong, like, as a musical system, I don't think obichod is particularly interesting, but I have enjoyed the heck out of singing whole services in obichod chant with a good choir, right? So
if it's in tune, it's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Good tune, a well-tuned chord is its own beauty.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And if you're in a choir that really knows the tones really well and can sing through a text, like just like it's second nature in whatever that tone is in obichod chant, it's beautiful. It gets old after a while, but it can be beautiful, right? So
yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of, it's what other things would you like to tell people to go to reach you, and what things would you like to plug? Obviously, you have this amazing book that everyone that's interested in Byzantine chant should buy. But what other things are there?
And that book is available at bizchantlessonbook.com, which is a special URL that just points you to the Cappella Romana publishing page with that book, bizchantlessonbook.com. But also Cappella Romana Publishing has now, that was the first publication of Cappella Romana Publishing, and since then my Christmas volume, Son of Justice, and my volume for Orthodox Sacraments, Mysteries, has come out, as well as Sam Herron's Divine Liturgy book. And there's more. And there's more in the offing. Oh, and also the Cassiani Christmas uh, uh, publication, which is of medieval Byzantine chant and based on the work of Ioannis Arvanitis and things that we've recorded in Cappella Romana. But if people want to learn how to do this, I'm the founder and director of the St. John Kukuzelis Institute for Liturgical Arts, or of Liturgical Arts, and which is found at kukuzelis.net. That's KOUKOUZELIS.net. And there you can sign up for online classes and contact me personally for classes in Byzantine music and Orthodox liturgics, and also get in touch with me for private lessons, or I'll hook you up with one of my students as well. And then in addition to that, which is really my project, there's lots of things happening in Byzantine music education in the United States. One that I mentioned that I'm also the director of the music program is the Liturgical Arts Academy, which is theliturgicalarts.org, that holds intensive week-long workshops at the Diaconia Retreat Center in Salem, South Carolina. We just had an all-beginners workshop for Byzantine music, along with a workshop with an iconography and also liturgical cooking there just a couple of weeks ago. And so I had Sam Herron and I each had 8 students apiece, all of whom were beginners to Byzantine music, and took them through basically chapter 1 of my book. And then that program also has an intensive week-long workshop in the summer in August that starting this last year has been for intermediate, advanced, and masterclass students. But either one of them is a wonderful experience. And then there are other programs out there by some of my friends and colleagues. There's something called the Trisaigon School. There's the School of Byzantine Music of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. There's the School of Liturgical Music for the Antiochian Archdiocese of America. And each local Greek Orthodox jurisdiction, it seems, has been coming up with its own sort of local school and training program for church musicians. So it's actually all very exciting what's happening right now, and thank God, right? We'll continue doing what we do, and God willing, it will continue to grow and flourish. And then as far as on the more sort of the side of just what recordings there are out there, obviously Cappella Romana, I'm heavily involved with everything that we do there. I have a recording that came out now many years ago with my dear friend and colleague Father John Rassam El Masih. We have a recording called Son of Justice, that is Byzantine music for Christmas. It's a 2 CD set. Yes, we still sell CDs. The first CD is Greek and Arabic, and the second CD is that same repertoire, all in English. And all kinds of things that have been happening in the last few years. And if you just type in Byzantine music into YouTube, you get all just these of varying degrees of quality, of course, but all kinds of things happening. So.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Everyone go check that out. So, thanks, and until we speak again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and God bless you and your work, and I hope we can talk again soon.